their memory is clearly working. However, one aspect of memory in particular that we call working memory is often disrupted. Working memory is the ability to keep specific information online, to recycle it in your brain over and over again so that you can use it in the immediate or short term. A good example of this would be you meet somebody, they tell you their name, they give you their phone number verbally, and you have to walk back to your phone and enter it into your phone. People without ADHD might have to put some effort into it. It might feel like a bit of a struggle, but typically they would be able to recite that phone number in their mind over and over and then put it into their phone. People with ADHD tend to lose the ability or lack the ability to remember things that they just need to keep online for anywhere from 10 seconds to a minute or two. Okay, so a string of numbers like 643-781 for most people would be pretty easy. 643-781, 643-781. You could probably remember that a minute from now without writing it down. But if you add one more number to that 643-7813, it gets tougher. Okay, so there's a reason why phone numbers typically have 7 digits in them. Of course, there's an area code, but remembering information that strings out longer than 7 numbers or a sentence or two, that's challenging for most people. People with ADHD have severe challenges even with much smaller batches of information over even much smaller batches of time. Deficits in working memory are also something that we see in people who have frontotemporal dementia, so damage to the frontal lobes, or age-related cognitive decline. And so it will come as no surprise that later when we discuss treatments, supplements, and other tools for ADHD, that many of those treatments, supplements, and tools for ADHD are similar to the ones that work for age-related cognitive decline. Okay, so we've more or less established the kind of menu of items that people with ADHD tend to have. Some have all of them, some have just a subset of them. Their severity can range from very intense to mild, but in general, it's challenges with attention and focus, challenges with impulse control. They get annoyed easily. They have kind of an impulsivity. They can't stay on task. Time perception can be off. They use the piling system or a system that doesn't work well for them in order to organize their things in physical space. And they have a hard time with anything that's mundane that they're not really interested in. But again, I just want to highlight that people with ADHD are able to obtain heightened levels of focus, even hyperfocus, for things that are exciting to them and that they really want to engage in. So now you have the contour of what ADHD is. And if you're somebody who doesn't have ADHD, you should also be asking yourself which aspects of ADHD are similar to things I've experienced before. Because what we know about the healthy brain is that there's also a range of abilities to focus. Some people focus very well on any task. You give them a task, they can just laser in on that task. Other people, they have to kind of fight an internal battle. They have to convince themselves that it's important or interesting. They have to kind of incentivize themselves internally. Other people, doesn't matter. They could be bored to tears with the information, but they can do it just because they are, quote unquote, very disciplined people. We tend to admire those people, but as you'll see a little bit later, it's not clear that that's the best way to run your attentional system. There might be something to this business of having heightened levels of attention for the things that you are most interested or excited by. So let's drill into this issue of why people with ADHD actually can focus very intensely on things that they enjoy and are curious about. Now, enjoyment and curiosity are psychological terms. They're not even really psychological terms. They're just the way that we describe our human experience of liking things, wanting to know more about them. But from a neurobiological perspective, they have a very clear identity and signature, and that's dopamine. Dopamine is released from neurons. It's what we call a neuromodulator. And as a neuromodulator, it changes the activity of the circuits in the brain such that certain circuits are more active than others. And in particular, dopamine creates a heightened state of focus. It tends to contract our visual world, and it tends to make us pay attention to things that are outside and beyond the confines of our skin. It's what we call exteroception. Dopamine also tends to put us in a state of motivation, and wanting things outside the confines of our skin. So whether or not we're pursuing something physical in our world, or whether or not we're pursuing information in our outside world, dopamine is largely responsible for our ability and our drive to do that. But dopamine as a neuromodulator is also involved in changing the way that we perceive the world. So as I mentioned earlier, you have all these senses coming in, and you can only perceive some of them because you're only paying attention to some of them. Dopamine, when it's released in our brain, tends to turn on areas of our brain that narrow our visual focus and our auditory focus. So it creates a cone of auditory attention that's very narrow, creates a tunnel of visual attention that's very narrow. Whereas when we have less dopamine, we tend to view the entire world. We tend to see the whole scene that we are in. We tend to hear everything all at once. So as I describe this, hopefully you're already starting to see and understand how having dopamine release can allow a person, whether or not they have ADHD or not, to direct their attention to particular things in their environment. Right? So now what we're doing is we're moving away from attention as this kind of vague, ambiguous term, and we're giving it a neurochemical identity, dopamine, and we are giving it a neural circuit identity. And just to put a little bit of flavor and detail on which neural circuits those are, I want to discuss two general types of neural circuits that dopamine tends to enhance. So let's talk neural circuits. And for those of you that love hearing neuroscience nomenclature, you're going to eat this part up. And for those of you that don't like a lot of names of brain areas, I invite you to tune out or just try and grab the top contour of this. I will describe it in pretty general terms, but I will give some detail because I know there are some of you out there who really want to dig deeper into what the exact structures and connectivities are. Okay? So there are two main types of circuits that we need to think about with respect to ADHD, attention and dopamine. The first one is called the default mode network. The default mode network is the network of brain areas in your brain, in my brain, and in everybody's brain that is active when we're not doing anything, when we're just sitting there idle at rest. Now, it's very hard to not think about anything, but when you're not engaged in any type of specific task, so you're not driving, you're not playing a video game, you're not trying to study, you're not trying to listen, you're just sitting there letting your brain kind of go wherever it wants to go, your default mode network underlies that state of mind. The other set of circuits that we're going to think about and talk about with respect to ADHD are the task networks. The networks of the brain that make you goal-oriented, or that are at least trying to make you goal-oriented. And those are a completely different set of brain areas. However, the default mode network and these task networks are communicating with one another, and they're doing that in very interesting ways. So first I want to describe how these two sets of brain areas, the default mode network and the task networks, normally interact. Okay? So a little bit of naming here. Again, feel free to ignore it if you don't want this level of detail, but the default mode network includes an area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Frontal cortex, no surprise, is in the front, and you have a dorsal, the top, and side, lateral part, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You got one on each side of your brain, right? And then you have a brain area called the posterior cingulate cortex. And then you have an area called the lateral parietal lobe. Again, you don't need to remember these names, but these are three brain areas that normally are synchronized in their activity. So when one of these areas is active in a typical person, the other areas would be active as well. So it's a little bit like a symphony or a band, like a three-piece band. It's like drums, guitar, and bass. They're playing together. Okay? That's how it is in a typical person. In a person with ADHD, or even a person who has subclinical ADHD, or in any human being who hasn't slept well, what you find is the default mode network is not synchronized. These brain areas are just not playing well together. Now, the task networks include a different set of structures. It still involves the prefrontal cortex, but it's a different part of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, tends to be the medial prefrontal cortex. And there's some other brain areas that the medial prefrontal cortex is communicating to all the time, mainly to suppress impulses. It's shutting down the desire to stand up or to scratch the side of your cheek or your nose if you're trying not to do that. Anytime you're restricting your behavior, these task-directed networks are very active. Okay? Now, normally, in a person without ADHD, The task networks and the default mode networks are going in kind of seesaw fashion. They are actually what we call anti-correlated. So it's not just that they are not correlated, they are actually opposing one another. They are anti-correlated. In a person with ADHD, the default mode networks and the task networks are actually more coordinated. That might come as surprising. I think that we all have this tendency to kind of jump to conclusion and assume that somebody who doesn't have an easy time paying attention or has ADHD, that their brain must be completely incoherent, that it's not working well and because everything's out of whack. But there's something interesting about people with ADHD whereby the task networks and the default mode networks are actually working together in a way that's correlated, and that is what's abnormal. So this would be like the guitar, bass, and the drums playing together in a way where the bass isn't keeping the backbeat and the drums aren't keeping the backbeat, that they're playing together, they're all playing the melodies and harmonies in a way that just doesn't sound right. That's what's going on in the brain of somebody with ADHD. And we can now confidently say, based on brain imaging studies, that when somebody gets better when they're treated for ADHD or when they age out of ADHD, as sometimes is the case, that the default mode networks and the task networks tend to become anti-correlated again. Okay? So that's the underlying neurobiology, but you'll notice that I didn't mention dopamine at all. What dopamine is doing in this context is dopamine is acting like a conductor. Dopamine is saying if this circuit should be active, then that circuit should be active. It should be default mode network, and then when the default mode network is not active, then it should be the task network. So it's really acting as a conductor saying, you go, now you go, now you go, now you go. And in ADHD, there's something about the dopamine system that is not allowing it to conduct these networks and make sure that they stay what, the engineers or physicists or mathematicians would say out of phase, to be anti-correlated. Okay, out of phase and anti-correlate, essentially the same thing, at least for purposes of this discussion. So that raises two questions. Could it be that dopamine is not at sufficiently high levels? Or could it be that dopamine is just doing it all wrong? In other words, is there no conductor, or is the conductor playing with like little tiny toothpicks and so the instruments can't see what they're supposed to do? They can't get the instruction because it's just not loud enough, so to speak. Or could it be that the information is getting out, but the information that's getting out is wrong? The conductor is there, but the conductor isn't very good at conducting. Now, we can gain insight into how this system works and fails